The laughter began with the sound of fire. It was the spring of 1944 at Camp Hearn, Texas, one of more than 500 prisoner of war camps scattered across the United States. Beyond the barbed wire, the evening wind carried the dry scent of prairie dust and pine. Inside the camp, hundreds of German prisoners had finished their meager dinner, watery stew and stale bread, when a new sound broke the monotony. Pop, then another, then a series of sharp bursts, like distant gunfire, but playful somehow. A few American guards stood around a blackened pot, laughing as they poured dried yellow kernels into sizzling oil. Flames danced on their faces, glinting off brass buttons. The smell of melted butter drifted across the compound, rich, strange, irresistible. From the barracks, curious eyes watched through narrow windows. Lieutenant Karl Meissner, who had once commanded an artillery unit in North Africa, frowned and crossed his arms. "Americans," he muttered to a fellow officer. "Children playing with food. That's their war effort." The men around him chuckled, that dry, superior kind of laughter that hides discomfort. Outside, a guard named Private Sam Collins stirred the pot with a stick. The corn began to explode in bright white puffs. Leaping from the pan, "See that," he said to his friend. "Freedom food, it fights back before it feeds you." They both laughed, tossing the golden puffs into a tin bowl. From the shadows, Meissner's men stared. The sound was both absurd and mesmerizing. Each pop was a miniature detonation, yet harmless, joyful. One soldier whispered, "It's like watching fireworks in a pan." Another snorted, "Or chaos just like America." But what none of them admitted was that the smell was intoxicating, sweet, buttery, warm, the kind of scent that didn't belong in war. In his small journal, hidden beneath his mattress, Private Heinrich Bauer, 22, once a baker from Hamburg, scribbled that night. "Today they made some kind of roasted corn. It popped in fire like tiny explosions." The guards laughed, not cruelly, but freely. "I don't understand it yet." The night deepened. The Americans leaned against the fence, eating their strange snack with casual joy. The Germans retreated into their barracks, still smirking, but their laughter had changed. It was thinner now, uncertain. Behind those wire fences, something had started. Not rebellion, not escape, but curiosity. The kind that seeps in quietly, like the smell of butter through a crack in the door. And for the first time, the prisoners realized that America's strength might not lie only in its tanks or bombers, but in something softer, the audacity to find pleasure in the middle of war. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Morning sunlight cut through the camp's wooden slats, striking rows of iron bunks and faces half asleep from restless dreams. Outside, the scent of corn oil still lingered faintly in the air, clinging to the dust. A group of German prisoners gathered near the fence, pretending to stretch, pretending not to care, but all of them waiting for something. Then, the sound came again. Pop, pop, pop. Tiny bursts of defiance, as if the earth itself had learned to laugh. Private Sam Collins stood beside his pot once more, grinning. "Breakfast show's on. Boys," he joked to a fellow guard, throwing in a handful of yellow kernels. Within seconds, the oil hissed and crackled, the kernels transforming into white clouds that tumbled over each other. Across the wire, the Germans tried not to look. Lieutenant Meissner sneered. "Listen to them. Their food explodes before it's eaten." Another prisoner added, "They make noise even when they cook. Americans can't stand silence." Laughter followed, sharp and brittle, an echo of superiority, the only weapon left to men stripped of everything else. But curiosity has a way of betraying pride. One of the younger prisoners, Bauer, the former baker, leaned closer to the fence, fascinated by the rhythm. Each pop was a tiny, chaotic miracle. He whispered, almost to himself, "It's like watching seeds revolt." When the pot emptied, the guards poured golden butter into the pan, the fragrance drifting lazily across the yard. It wasn't just food anymore, it was spectacle, a performance of abundance. For men who had come from a collapsing empire, where factories burned and ration cards ruled life, that smell carried insult and wonder in equal measure. Meissner clenched his fists. "Even their food mocks us," he murmured. "It explodes for their amusement while our families dig for potatoes." The remark silenced the others. A moment of realization passed through the group, quiet, uneasy. The sound of popcorn had become more than a curiosity. It was a reminder of imbalance. In his diary that evening, Bauer wrote again, "They laugh as their corn explodes. I think they see beauty in destruction. We, who made destruction an art, cannot see the beauty anymore." That single sentence, later found by Allied censors, would be marked with a note, possible sign of ideological fatigue, by nightfall. The laughter in the barracks had dimmed. The men lay awake, still hearing the faint echoes of kernels bursting a child's sound, simple and harmless, yet haunting. What began as mockery was turning into something else: fascination, unease, perhaps even envy, in a war defined by violence. The Americans had found joy that made noise, and that joy was louder than guns. That afternoon, the sun beat down over the dusty yard of Camp Hearn. The air shimmered above the barbed wire, and somewhere near the mess hall, another pot began to rattle. The familiar rhythm of popping kernels pulled eyes and ears again, whether they wanted it or not. Private Sam Collins, the same young guard with freckles and an easy grin, waved toward the German enclosure. "Hey fellas," he called out, "want some? It's not a weapon, I promise." The men behind the fence froze. Some smirked, others whispered, but no one moved. Lieutenant Meissner stood in the shade of the barracks doorway, his arms crossed tight. "Don't be fooled," he muttered. "They want to humiliate us. Watch how they play generous. Just to make us beg." A murmur of agreement followed. Pride was still armor, and suspicion was still safety. But then the breeze shifted. The scent of hot butter, melted salt, and roasted corn drifted through the fence. It was too human a smell, too warm, too innocent, and for a moment, even the officers couldn't help inhaling. Collins smiled again, tossing a puff into his mouth. "See, we share the good stuff. It's not all rations and bullets out here." A few of his fellow guards chuckled. One of them, a black corporal named Henry Lee, raised his eyebrows toward the Germans and added softly, "Ain't no harm in sharing a little joy." Meissner stiffened. The presence of a black man giving orders to white soldiers was, for him, the ultimate contradiction. He turned away, muttering under his breath, his worldview cracking in places he didn't yet understand. Meanwhile, Bauer, the young baker, lingered at the fence. His stomach growled, but something deeper stirred a need to understand. These Americans laughed, shared, invited, even in captivity. They behaved as though war hadn't touched them. He whispered, "How do they laugh so easily?" The camp fell quiet as the guards carried their bowls toward the fence. A few pieces of popcorn rolled across the dirt, landing just short of the prisoners' boots. No one moved. Even the birds stopped chirping. It was the first true silence the camp had known in months. Not the silence of fear or punishment, but of hesitation, of boundaries shifting in real time. The Americans waited a few seconds longer, then shrugged and walked off, leaving the bowl on a wooden crate by the fence. As the sun dipped low, its light spilled through the wire, turning each strand to gold. The bowl sat untouched, glowing softly, like a test no one dared to take. Inside the barracks, someone whispered, "Maybe tomorrow," and the smell of butter, faint but stubborn, lingered in the night air, wrapping the camp in something unfamiliar, an invitation. The next day dawned still and heavy, with clouds crouching low over the Texas plain. By afternoon, a strange calm had settled over the camp, not the usual tense silence, but something softer, expectant, near the fence. The bowl from yesterday still sat on the crate, now filled again by the Americans, as if waiting. The guards made no gesture this time. They just walked away, leaving the offering, and one by one, the prisoners drifted toward it. Lieutenant Meissner watched from a distance, his jaw tight. "They're testing us," he whispered. "They want to see who's weak." But even as he spoke, the smell reached him: hot butter and roasted salt in the dry air, rich enough to feel like home. Private Bauer, the baker, stood closest. He hesitated, glancing toward the others. "They left it again," he said quietly. A fellow prisoner snorted. "You think it's safe?" Bauer shrugged. "I think it's warm. He reached out slowly through the wire, his fingers brushing the edge of the bowl. The popcorn felt impossibly light, almost fragile. He picked up a single white puff, studied it for a moment, then placed it in his mouth. The sound, a soft crunch, broke the tension like glass. His eyes widened, The taste was strange and wonderful, a mix of salt, smoke, and sweetness. He froze, then laughed aloud, not the bitter laughter of pride, but genuine surprise. "It explodes in my mouth," he said, his voice cracking with amusement. Someone behind him burst out laughing, then another, and suddenly, the camp echoed with laughter deep, human, uncontrollable. Even the guards, watching from a distance, couldn't help but smile. Collins leaned against the fence, shaking his head. "Guess it ain't a weapon after all," he said softly. Corporal Henry Lee chuckled beside him. "No, but maybe it's disarming." Inside the camp, the laughter rolled like a wave. For a few precious minutes, war disappeared, ranks, orders, flags, none of it mattered. Just the sound of men laughing at something so small, so absurd, that it felt holy. Later that night, Bauer wrote in his diary, "Today I laughed, and no one told me not to. The guards laughed too. Perhaps laughter is the only thing that doesn't belong to any side." Outside, the guards cleaned up their station, leaving a few extra handfuls of kernels near the fence. The fire crackled low. The stars blinked awake, for the first time in months. Both sides slept with lighter hearts united, not by orders, but by the sound of something harmless exploding into joy. That evening, as dusk spread over Camp Hearn, the prisoners heard a sound they hadn't known in months. Music, a harmonica, soft and clumsy, played somewhere near the recreation yard. The guards were setting up something big, something unusual, when darkness finally fell. A white sheet was stretched between two poles, a projector whirred to life, light flickered, shadows danced, and then, on that makeshift screen, a familiar figure stumbled across the frame. Charlie Chaplin, bowler hat and cane, chasing his hat in the wind. "Movie night!" Private Collins called out cheerfully, his voice carrying over the fence. "Everyone's welcome, even the critics." Laughter rippled through the American camp, but this time, it wasn't mocking. A few German prisoners wandered closer to the fence, then more, until nearly the entire camp pressed forward. And then came the scent again, popcorn, big bowls of it, passed from hand to hand. To the Germans' astonishment, the guards didn't keep it for themselves. They started offering handfuls through the fence. This time, no one hesitated. The first piece was taken quietly, the next with a smile. Before long, the fence became a table, Americans on one side, Germans on the other, sharing food under the stars, on screen. Chaplin slipped on a banana peel. Laughter erupted, rolling like thunder across the yard. Guards and prisoners laughed together, their voices mingling with the hiss of the projector and the rustle of popcorn bags. Private Bauer wrote in his diary later that night, "For an hour, we were not prisoners. We were men laughing at the same foolish man." And the sound of popcorn mixed with laughter, I will never forget that sound. Even Lieutenant Meissner watched from a distance, arms folded, his face unreadable. When Chaplin raised his eyebrows in confusion, even he smiled faintly, a tiny surrender. By the time the film ended, the night had turned cool. Fireflies drifted lazily over the wire. The projector clicked off, and silence returned gentle. "Not hostile," someone on the American side called out. "Same time tomorrow," someone on the German side answered. "Only if you bring more popcorn." The guards roared with laughter. It was absurd. Two nations still at war yet in this small Texas field. Peace had already rehearsed its first scene. As the prisoners walked back to their barracks, some turned once more to the empty screen. The white sheet swayed in the wind, glowing softly in the moonlight like a flag that belonged to no country, fluttering only for laughter. Canned joy, even in the smallest form, cross a fence higher than any wall built by fear. The following morning, long after the laughter had faded, Lieutenant Karl Meissner sat at a rough wooden desk in his barrack, his fountain pen trembling slightly in his hand. He had watched the Americans all night, their ease, their laughter, their odd ability to live as if war were a passing inconvenience. It disturbed him more than their victory on the battlefield ever had. He began to write. We mocked their food, their noise, their strange customs. Yet I begin to think it is we who are strange, living only to obey, to endure. They live to feel. They make even their meals into celebrations. Outside, Private Bauer knelt by a flower bed near the fence, trimming weeds as part of the day's work detail. One of the guards, Corporal Henry Lee, tossed him a few unpopped kernels from his pocket. Plant those, he said with a grin. You never know what might grow. Bauer smiled faintly, pocketing the kernels. Maybe laughter. He replied, At noon, a truck arrived with supplies, sacks of flour, canned meat, and to everyone's surprise, several large tins labeled corn sweet shelled. A few German prisoners exchanged knowing looks. They even canned laughter now, one joked, and the camp erupted in chuckles. Meissner observed from afar, both amused and unsettled. He remembered his early days as an officer in Africa, how he had prided himself on order, on control, here, in this American land of noise and abundance. Everything seemed to defy control. Even their kindness felt undisciplined. That night, under dim bulbs, he wrote again in his journal. We thought strength was silence, obedience, iron. But perhaps it is joy noisy, careless joy that wins wars. They make a celebration out of survival. I wonder if we ever will. In another corner of the camp, Bauer shared a small bag of popcorn with 3 others. The ration was meager, but it felt abundant. One of them, a schoolteacher named Ernst Weber, said thoughtfully, They fight with tanks. Yes, but they conquer with this the idea that life can be light. The men nodded. For the first time, their talk turned not to escape or bitterness, but to what life might look like after the war. Perhaps, Bauer mused, we could sell this popcorn in Germany someday, a theater treat, something to make people laugh again. They all smiled, imagining it not as prisoners, but as men with futures. Do you think joy, not ideology, not power, could be the truest weapon that ends every war? Outside, the night wind carried a faint smell of butter. The guards laughed softly somewhere by the kitchen, and across the fence, unseen. The prisoners smiled in the dark, each one holding, in his mind, the echo of that laughter and the warmth of something new taking root. The war ended quietly for Camp Herne. The summer of 1945 arrived with heat thick enough to melt the horizon, and rumors of Germany's surrender spread like wind through barbed wire. By autumn, most of the prisoners had been told they would soon be sent home, but no one celebrated. The news felt too heavy to lift. One afternoon, Bauer stood by the garden fence, the same one where he had once reached for a handful of popcorn. The small patch where he'd buried those kernels months before had sprouted into thin, stubborn stalks of corn. The plants shimmered pale gold under the Texas sun, and he stared at them for a long time before whispering, They grew. Lieutenant Meissner joined him, his face older, gentler now. Strange. He said, You plant an American seed in German hands, and it still grows straight. Bauer smiled faintly. Maybe it doesn't care whose soil it's in. The following spring, the men were repatriated. Bauer carried a few dried ears of corn wrapped in newspaper. When he boarded the transport ship in Galveston, he clutched them like relics. In Germany, the landscape was unrecognizable burned towns, hollowed homes, ghosts of factories. Bauer returned to his village near Lübeck and planted the kernels in a small corner of his mother's garden. Neighbors laughed. You brought back American tricks now. He only smiled. Something like that. By harvest season, the stalks had grown tall and healthy, and one gray afternoon, as he heated a pan on the stove, his son watched curiously. Papa, what are you doing? Bauer poured a few kernels into the pan. Minutes later, pop, pop, pop. The child jumped back, startled. Bauer laughed, the same laugh that had once filled a prison yard. Listen, son, he said softly. That's the sound of peace. He handed the boy a piece still warm, soft, and salty. The boy grinned, crumbs clinging to his lips. Bauer looked toward the window, the fading sun touching the fields. The sound of those tiny explosions filled the room, echoing across time and memory. Somewhere in Texas, another pot might have been popping that very evening. Two worlds connected by something absurd and beautiful, a sound that once crossed a fence and never stopped echoing. Later, in a letter discovered decades afterward, Lieutenant Meissner wrote from Berlin in 1953. When I hear corn pop, I remember not defeat, but discovery. The Americans did not teach us democracy, they taught us how to laugh again. The image fades, an old man standing by his stove, the smell of butter thick in the air, a child's laughter filling the kitchen, and as the final pops fade, the question lingers in silence. If joy can explode like popcorn, where would you plant it in a world still filled with hate? Years later, historians would look back at the prisoner camps scattered across the American South and Midwest and find something quietly revolutionary in their simplicity. No political indoctrination, no forced conversions, just small human gestures, a shared laugh, a cup of coffee, a paper bag of popcorn passed through wire. For many of those men, that was the true beginning of peace. In a world scarred by ideology, a handful of buttered corn seemed trivial. Yet inside Camp Hearn, it became a language that needed no translation. It spoke of abundance, of absurdity, of freedom's strange confidence. It was the opposite of what the prisoners had been taught to admire. Power, they learned, was not the ability to command fear, it was the courage to remain kind when the world turned cruel. When some of them returned to Germany, they wrote home about the Americans' madness, their endless laughter, their sweet corn, their careless optimism. But the letters that mattered most carried something quieter, something almost sacred. They fed us, and somehow, it changed me. Historians later discovered that in post-war Germany, popcorn began appearing in small cinemas rebuilt from rubble. Long before Coca-Cola and neon lights arrived, no one could trace who started it. But perhaps it was one of those former prisoners, a man who once laughed behind barbed wire, now watching a movie beside his child, handing him a paper bag filled with warmth. The story of popcorn in war sounds foolish until you understand what it replaced: hunger, suspicion, silence. In its place came sound, the soft explosions of peace, of a new world being born one kernel at a time. Maybe that's how history truly heals, not through treaties or speeches, but through the quiet persistence of joy, fragile, ridiculous, and unstoppable.